So excited to be here and so excited to have you here with us. We're going to start off today with a few announcements, and then we're going to move into our feature for today, which is pest and plant disease issues of roses in North Carolina landscapes and really throughout the Southeast. I will talk about some plant disease instead, alternatives to roses. We'll finish up with bolos, which are be on the lookout for pest and disease issues, and a few announcements at the end. So I did want to just share this picture. Spring is certainly on the way. This is from my garden. This is a Lenten rose, which is not a rose that we're going to talk about today. So this is a type of helleborus, but they are just starting to burst open and bloom. Good sign spring is on the way. So we are launching our new season today, and we will be holding Plants, Pests, and Pathogens the 4th Tuesdays from now through October. So look forward to having you here for each one of our sessions. We do run from 10 to 11:30 for the live sessions. They are, of course, recorded, so you can always watch the recordings later if you miss us. And we will be sticking to our schedule that we've been doing for the past few years, where every other month, starting in February, we have a focus on current pest and plant disease issues, sometimes the pests and diseases of a specific plant, sometimes just what's going on across the state. So we look forward to having Matt and Mike with us for February, April, June, August, and October. Of course, they'll be with us every month, but in those months, they will be the feature presenters and will be giving us a deep dive into specific issues that are going on at that time. During March, May, July, and September, we will have guest speakers who will be talking about current horticultural issues. Next month in March, we're excited to welcome Dr. Bill Fontenot, who is a professor emeritus at NC State, and he's going to talk about growing great garden soil. You can go to go.ncsu.edu/PPP to explore the schedule and see who else we have lined up for this season. And in those months where we have guest speakers, we will still have our bolos, our be on the lookout, and we'll still have our plant these instead. So we just will have the deep dive into the current issues. Just a few things about plants, pests, and pathogens. If you're new or it's been a while since you joined us, Plants, Pests, and Pathogens is here to provide continuing education for extension agents and master gardener volunteers. And we have a strong focus on current horticultural and gardening issues, and especially the current plant disease and pest issues. So this is to help support your education and outreach in your communities. And we know every day so many questions and calls come into extension offices and emails, of course, about what's wrong with my plant. So Plants, Pests, and Pathogens is really here to help you answer those questions. We do focus on diagnostic tips, so helping you to diagnose problems, discussing what the current issues are, what you should be looking out for. And we don't go into recommendations so much, but by giving you the plant or plant disease or pest name, that empowers you to find that information. Once you have the name of a plant, of an insect, of a disease, it's so easy to search and find that information. And we have some links here that we'll send out in our follow-up email where you can go and find that type of information, either from our extension publications and resources. We encourage everybody to use the Extension Foundation OneSearch engine, which just searches extension systems across the United States. So that way you know you're getting research-based information. And then, of course, search engines such as Google, and we have some search tips specifically for Google posted that you can explore later. So once you have the name, you can easily find those control recommendations. But getting the name is the key thing. So that's why we focus on those diagnostic tips to get you to that place. Our Plants, Pests, and Pathogens team is Matt Bertone and Mike Munster from the NC State Plant Disease and Insect Clinic. And then there's myself, Charlotte Glen, and Caroline Richardson with the NC State Extension Master Gardener Program. And we're so glad to be able to bring this to you each month. And as we mentioned, we do record, and we put our recordings on YouTube on the NC State EMG channel. So you can go and find the recordings straight from our playlist, or we do have a page as well that we have an index, which is by date. So if you just happen to remember, I heard something on a specific date and you want to look it up that way, you can go to our recording index. We do want to point out with our recordings, we do add timestamps to the description of them, and that's to help you jump ahead and find the content you're looking for if you're going back to watch those recordings. So when you open one of our recordings on YouTube, there'll be a description that'll be kind of below the player that's up at the top of the screen, and there'll be this button that says Show More. And you definitely always want to click on the Show More, because the opening part of the description doesn't show you the timestamps. And when you click on that Show More, it'll open another part of the description, or the full description, and you'll see these little, they look like times and they're in blue. And those are the timestamps that allow you to click on them and jump to that specific section. So we hope that's really helpful if you want to see something, a pest feature, or just a certain part of a past recording. These should help you get there quickly. Click on the blue timestamps and you can jump right to that section. I want to give a quick shout out to Martha Anderson. I hope she's here with us today. I have not checked on the participants list, but I hope Martha's with us. Martha has been working on adding subtitles, or correcting the automatically generated subtitles that go along with our recordings, and really are so appreciative of the work she's been doing on those. So give her a round of applause and a virtual bouquet, and just say thank you so much for the work you've been doing, Martha. And if you're not familiar with how to view the subtitles on YouTube, when you're watching the video on YouTube, down at the little icons that are at the bottom of the YouTube player, you'll see this one that says CC. And if you click on that one, it'll open the subtitles for you. And if we've got other people out there who are interested in helping with the subtitles, we encourage you to reach out to us. You can email Caroline and myself at ncemgprogram@ncsu.edu. But just think a little bit, we do strongly recommend that, or say that the requirements of being able to do it are having a strong, reliable internet connection, being comfortable working online, because this is done online on YouTube, and having good spelling and grammar skills, just so you can catch and pick up on the things that need to be corrected. But we do encourage you to reach out to us if this is something you're interested in. We've got older recordings that still need to be done, and we've always got our new recordings coming in. It is it's enjoyable, and you really learn, again, what's discussed with plants, pests, and pathogens. It's I would say it is especially going to be enjoyable for somebody who's detail-oriented, doesn't mind spending time working for like a few hours, because it's not a super fast process, but you certainly get a good sense of completion when you're done with one of them. And many, many thanks again to Martha. All right, so that brings us up to our feature for today, and I'm going to turn it over to Matt and Mike to tell us about rose, pest, and plant disease issues. I will stop my share so they can start sharing.
Thanks, Charlotte.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to begin so we have enough time. We have a lot to cover today because roses get a lot of issues. So welcome. Thanks for coming on this Tuesday, spelled TWO. Today is 2/22/22. So I don't know if it's special about that, but I will be showing you a couple of things with twos in their names. But today I'm going to start out with the arthropods associated with roses, and Mike Munster will follow up with diseases of roses. So as far as the arthropods go, several groups can be found feeding on roses. They can do multiple things. You can either defoliate or skeletonize leaves, feed on the flowers, suck the sap, or some root pests. I'm not really going to go into many root pests, but things like some beetle larvae, as well as voles and vertebrates like that can actually sever the roots of roses. So without further ado, let's talk about some critters. So we got a little peekaboo here coming through a hole in a rose leaf. And this is going to introduce our first group. This is probably one of the more major groups of pests on arthropods on roses, and that is the sawflies. So sawflies are a group of Hymenoptera. That's the group that includes the order that includes bees, ants, and wasps. And they're all in the family Tenthrodinidae, which is the common sawfly family. The larvae are caterpillar-like, as you'll see in a moment, but with 6 or more pairs of prolegs. Those are those fleshy legs on the abdomen, and only a single eye, or what's called a stema. This is the simple eye that larvae have. There are 3 main species on roses that I'll go into in a second. And this made me realize an interesting thing, that there aren't really many major caterpillar pests on roses. There are some that might munch on rosebuds or anything like that, but honestly, there aren't a lot of caterpillar pests. So if you see something that looks like a caterpillar, it's probably going to be a sawfly larva. Okay, and so you'll see these holes in the leaves and you're not sure what you're looking for, but there is a little tiny culprit here. If you can find it, it's actually right down here, this little tiny worm-like organism, and that's the larval sawfly. So before I get into the groups, this is actually what an adult sawfly looks like. Again, it's a wasp, so you wouldn't think that that would come from a caterpillar-like larva. But the males and females mate when they emerge. They emerge from these paper-like cocoons. And the females use a saw-like ovipositor to insert eggs into leaves, and that's where they get their name, sawflies. The larvae hatch and begin to feed, and when the feeding is complete, the larvae move to the ground or sometimes the plant to pupate in a silken cocoon for the most part. And these cocoons are very papery and brown, and this is a specimen I reared from some rose material from my yard. So the first one is going to be the bristly rose slug sawfly. This is the species Cladius deformis. They're fairly hairy, which is actually fairly rare for sawflies. Most sawflies may have little fleshy projections on them or bumps, but to be fuzzy is kind of rare for a sawfly. So it's pretty easy to ID this one. They do start in early spring, so once it starts to warm up, the leaves come out on the roses, we're going to start to see these critters, and this is probably the most common species of sawfly on roses. They begin by creating windows from under the leaf, and then they chew larger holes when they get older. And if we go back to this picture, you can see these windows right here where they've just chewed the lower surface of the leaf. There are multiple generations per year here in North Carolina, and they can also sometimes feed on caneberries and strawberries in addition to rose. Of course, these plants are all closely related, and so there's often actually an overlap in the species that affect them. The curled rose sawfly, Elantis cinctus, you can see it's curled up here. They look a lot more grub-like. They're pale green with these white dots. They're actually white-colored fleshy protuberances and an orange head. The young of these skeletonized leaves, while the older individuals feed from the edge to the center of the leaves, and they may pupate in the pith of the pruned canes. So it's a nice space for them to kind of get cozy. There are likely 2 generations in North Carolina, starting in the early summer. And the final slug sawfly, the rose slug, Endolomia ethiops, these are similar to the previous one, but they typically don't curl up, and the larvae are without ornamentation. So they're kind of smooth. They don't have hairs. They don't have little white protrusions out of their body. They'll skeletize the upper surface of the rose leaves very severely, and you begin to see these around May or June. I haven't seen many of them. They're not super common, as was either same with the previous species. I would say the bristly slug sawfly is most common. The damage can be severe, and apparently these have 1 generation per year, and they overwinter as pupae in their cocoons. And you can see some of their damage here. And I talked about these slug sawflies, these sawflies of roses a few sessions ago, maybe a couple years ago. But one sample we got into the clinic, a photo of a rose bush was completely skeletonized. And although there weren't any insect photos sent, I highly suspect these were the rose slug causing this. And you can see the fecal matter on the leaves, and basically the leaves are just completely scraped off the top of. And so that's those sawfly larvae grazing on the surface. Now, we don't typically talk too much about control in PPP. It's mostly for identification, but just for sawfly control, really it's aesthetic damage. Rarely causes permanent damage to the roses, especially the bristly slug sawflies, which make usually small holes in the leaves. The hatching larvae, catching the larvae early, cultural control can be done. You can pick them off the leaves or just kind of knock them into a soapy bucket of water. In large landscapes, you can use chemical control. But I just want to point out they will not respond to BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis, which has a toxin that's effective against caterpillars, but they are not effective. It's not effective against sawflies. So one thing to note then, so make sure you ID your sawflies correctly. And I guess I should go back and show you the single eye. Again, they have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 pairs of prolegs here on this one, and this single eye spot, which will distinguish it from caterpillars. Okay. Now, a really fairly rare sawfly I would love to see actually, but have not, is this stem sawfly in the family Cephidae, completely different type of sawfly. They inject eggs into the canes, and the larvae will bore in the pith. There's related species on raspberries and other caneberries too. So this may be something you find if you have wilting of a cane and you split it open, you see a grub-like insect. It's probably a stem sawfly, although there are some beetle larvae that are similar. Okay, speaking of beetles, here's our first quiz. So which of these is a fuller rose beetle? Now, Pactus cervinus. And I'm going to start the quiz now, and we'll let it go for about 30 seconds, just so, yeah. For some reason the time keeps resetting. So I'll look on my watch. We'll do it for another 15 seconds. Ooh, very even distribution. Okay, we're gonna call it there. We've got 129, 130 people. Okay, well, sorry if you didn't get a chance. We've got to move on because we've got a lot to talk about. So I'm gonna end the poll and share the results. So it looks like we've got an even distribution fairly with the most percentage of D. So letter D. Okay, well, you're gonna learn what this is then in a few minutes. So looks like everybody's kind of on the fence with this. So let's get into some beetles. So there are several types of beetles that feed on roses. Most common damage is from chewing on the leaves and flowers. Some attack developing flowers or canes. And a few have larvae that will munch on roots, but we typically don't see any serious issues of root feeding larvae on roses. Like I said, voles can be an issue sometimes, but we don't see a lot of those root feeding ones. So the most common and the most kind of well-known one is the Japanese beetle, Papillia japonica. So these are very voracious rose feeders. They feed in groups. They actually are attracted to each other, so they'll come and kind of hit a rose plant real hard when there's lots of them, when they start to get a threshold. And these insects have this metallic green body with this duller brown elytra, the wing coverings, and these patches of white seedy along the abdomen. So they're fairly distinct. There's really no other beetle, though. There's one I'll show in a second that's kind of similar looking, but I'll show you how to tell the difference. But this was actually at a rest stop where you can see all the fecal matter. You can see all these skeletonized leaves. And so these have one generation per year. Adults usually emerge in late June or July and typically are gone by the end of August. So fairly short window of activity from the adults. Then they mate, lay eggs in the soil where the grubs then develop. The adults feed on the foliage of many types of plants, not just roses. So grapes are another preferred host, but roses are actually pretty high up there, if not one of the most delicious hosts for these types of beetles. The beetles attract each other beetles, so removing them from plants could help. So if you have some issues with them on your roses, you can go out in the morning and kind of knock the ones into a soapy bucket of water or remove them somewhere else that are on the plant, and that'll keep others from being attracted to the plant. Beetle bags are not effective. All the beetle bags do are attract them to a yard. The common joke among extension entomologists is if you want good control with beetle bags, what you do is you place the beetle bags in other people's yards, and that will help you. So we don't want to do that, of course, but anyway, beetle bags are not a good way to control Japanese beetles. Okay, now a couple other scarab beetles. Now, scarab beetles are Japanese beetles are a type of scarab as well. They're characterized by these lamellate antennae. The antennae, the club opens up like fingers at the end. And another species, very different looking, is the rose chafers. So there are a couple species in the genus Macrodactylus. All that means is big toe or big finger kind of, and that's because they have these really long legs. And so that's kind of one of the characteristics to look for: a thin body, really long reddish legs. They're also covered in these very thick yellow hairs all over. So this is another species that can feed on rose leaves. And a couple other scarab beetles are the monkey or dark Hoplia beetle, which I've talked about in previous PPPs, as well as the sand chafer or spring rose scarab, Strigoderma arbicola. Hoplia is recognized by their dark body, these white or pale scale-like CD, and a single claw on the hind leg. Whereas sand chafers are actually very similar and closely related to Japanese beetles, but they lack the white patches of CD on the abdomen. They're not really as green, and they have very deep ridges down the elytra. So these can both feed on flowers. They don't feed on leaves as much. They're usually only around for a short period of time in the spring, and apparently they're more attracted to lighter colored flowers than darker ones, so more the yellow and white varieties. And another beetle is the foliar rose beetle, and this is kind of a trick part of that question, so this is the answer, because it's not called the foliar rose weevil technically, even though it is a weevil. It does have a very short nose for a weevil, and it's kind of this chunky brown with bronze scales weevil. They have elbowed antennae like other weevils. And interestingly, this species, the adults are all females and flightless. So they reproduce parthenogenetically. So they just lay eggs on the plants. They feed on the foliage from the edge. That's a typical weevil thing. So chewing notches in the leaves. And they may feed on different plants. This actually has a big host range. They lay eggs on the plants, and the larvae drop to feed on roots, but we don't consider them a huge issue for these plants. And they're rarely a major pest. So, but just be aware that this is this large chunky weevil that will feed on roses. Now, I've never seen this species, but it's kind of interesting. The rose stem girdler is a bupressid or a jewel beetle related to emerald ash borer and some others, and the raspberry cane borer or redneck cane borer. And they lay eggs in the canes, and the larvae spiral around the twig, girdling it, which can cause canes to collapse. But this is not a very common species. I've never seen it myself. Okay, now moving on quickly to some sucking insects. So the Hemiptera, they have piercing sucking mouth parts. They feed on the sap of the plant, usually the phloem, so most of the sugar-rich stuff. And because they take so much sugar and fluids, this means they produce honeydew, where they eject the extra sugar and fluids out of their back end, and that lands on the plant and can actually encourage the growth of sooty molds. So if you see a rose that's a rose plant or plants nearby that are very sooty looking, that's a mold probably from a sucking insect on that plant or a plant nearby. So aphids and scales are the main groups. I'm just going to mention whiteflies can be present on roses. I don't see it very often, but I'm not going to mention that specifically. I'm just going to go into talking a little bit about aphids and scales. So aphids are pretty well known among people, I think. These small sucking insects are recognized by the tailpipes typically. So these are called cornicles or siphuncules. They're usually found in large groups. This is a fairly common sight on developing rose flowers and buds, where you see a huge colony. That rarely ever do you see one aphid. And you may even see the eggs. Some of these aphids overwinter as eggs, and many people don't realize that aphids do produce eggs, even though much of their life cycle they're reproducing asexually by just giving live birth. To overwinter, they overwinter as eggs. There are several species on roses, and that includes the rose aphid, Macrocyphum rosei, the potato aphid, Macrocyphum euphorbiae, and the cotton melon aphid of Aphis gossipii. So, but there are many types of aphids that will feed on roses. They typically feed on the tender shoots and buds, and moderate populations aren't really going to harm the plant. They're definitely something you might want to get rid of, but high populations can reduce the quality and quantity of flowers. So it's something to be on the lookout for. Now, I mentioned scale insects. I searched ScaleNet, and worldwide there are 146 species of scale insects associated with rosa species. So there are a lot, and obviously I'm not going to cover them all. Many of these are not even found in the US, but many of them are. But scale insects can be a common issue on roses, and you'll have all different types. So it may be something like mealybugs, wax scales, armored scales, which have a covering, or cottony cushion scales, which develop these large cottony sacs. So these are small sedentary insects that suck the sap. And usually, some of them may be hidden on the bark or under the bark. And so, be on the lookout. Some are more obvious, like the wax scales and mealybugs, but others are going to be a little bit less obvious. So if you're scouting your plants, take a look for these. Okay, next quiz. Which of these is a chili thrips? Skirta thrips dorsalis. I'm going to start. Oh shoot! I didn't share the results last time. So these are the results from last time. Let's see. I think I can close this. Let me start another poll. I am not able to stop that. Okay, let me relaunch a poll. I'm going to just relaunch the poll. So, okay, yeah, you've had plenty of time to look at these. Okay, so I've relaunched the poll. Which of these is a chili thrips? Okay. We'll give everyone another 20 seconds. Okay, looks like people are homing in on the yellow ones, not the black ones. Okay, I'm going to end it in about 5 seconds. All right, let's end that and share the results. Okay, so we have very tight, very tight percentage-wise. They're identical. B and C is the chili thrips. That's people are guessing. Very few for A, fewer for D, and very few for A. Okay, well, you're about to learn about these. So, so the answer to the first poll was the weevil. The fuller rose beetle is that weevil. So that was letter B. Okay. So let's talk about some thrips. So thrips on roses, there's several species of Thysanoptera that feed on roses. These are small lizard-like insects. I like to call them little lizard-like insects, but they're very tiny, so it's hard to see that. They do suck the juices and pigments out of flowers and leaves and can cause brown flowers, plant distortion, etc. Now, on the flip side, they can pollinate plants, so they can be important in some ways. So we've got these two yellow thrips that were in the quiz, and here you go. So the chili thrips is on the left, and the flower thrips is on the right. So the chili thrips have a more squat body. They're a little thicker. They have these large simple eyes. The simple eyes are orange and take up a large portion in the middle of the head, whereas the simple eyes on the flower thrips are much smaller. And these also have dark triangles on the abdominal segments, whereas these have dark bands. And I'll show you that in a second. So here, there's dark triangles on a chili thrips. You can also see these very large ocelli. They kind of look cute compared to other thrips, I say. I don't know if other people would think that, but I do. And so chili thrips, all stages feed on new plant growth, stunting and distorting it. They have a huge host range. It's a non-native thrips, but it's been here in the US for many years. Typically most severe in the late summer and early fall. These are not typically a cold tolerant species, but there are some strains that are. I will mention then that the answer to that quiz was C, just in case anybody wants to know. And the feeding causes leaf distortion and on a lot of hosts. So basically, here's on roses. They do like roses. We get a lot of samples on roses, and their feeding can cause things like this puckering of the tips of the leaves. Now, there are probably some nutrient deficiencies and things like that that may cause those symptoms in other plants and maybe even in roses. But this distortion is pretty common. As well as this kind of scarring. So you get these patches, these kind of strips of scarring and this distorted leaves. So if you see leaves like this on a rose, definitely search in the axils and the flower heads and things like that for little tiny yellow thrips. If you're wanting to ID them for sure, you can always send them in to us. And in fact, you can see how small these thrips are here. There's one right there. There's one right there. And we can help you identify those. Now, as far as the flower thrips, these are usually in the genus Frankliniella, and the larvae, the young immatures, and the adults look like this. Again, similar, but not exactly the same. And these typically don't do a lot of damage to roses, except for when they feed on the developing flowers, they may cause the petals to turn brown. So be on the lookout for that. There are ways to search for the thrips. You can smack a flower head onto a piece of paper and look for a little yellow thing squiggling around and kind of hopping around. But that's thrips on roses. Okay, I want to move along just to make sure that Mike gets some time. So spider mites on roses, these are typically, it's a two-spotted spider mite, 2 for Tuesday. And they feed on the undersides of leaves, causing these patches of stippling. May produce abundant silk, and the extensive damage can cause these large white patches on them, the leaves. Now, another mite I need to talk about before Mike goes is this is a spider mite. So you can see it's very small, smaller than a millimeter, but this is an eriophyid mite, even smaller than a spider mite. And these can be actually very important on roses. So there's several species that are found on roses. None do direct damage, but Mike is going to talk to you all about what Phylacoptes fructiferus, the rosebud mite, does, and it vectors rosette virus. And these are very small and cryptic. This is a scanning electron microscope image, and if you pull back the axils, you may see these little tiny specks. They are very tiny, so it's very difficult to see them. So sorry I had to go so quickly. I'm trying to give Mike some time, so I'm going to stop sharing and let Mike share.
All right, well, I get this up and running. I'll turn on my video here too. I'll need a minute to get this up. So Matt, if you want to take
questions. If anybody has any questions so far, please ask.
Matt, so far the chat is pretty quiet, but that was excellent. And I look forward to reviewing those slides. Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Can I ask it?
Sure.
Verbally? Okay. So of course, I know you don't like management questions, but just in thinking about those thrips, would a horticultural oil get to them if, you know, they're kind of down in there? Is that at all effective?
I don't think so. I think horticultural, I've not ever heard of horticultural oil being used for thrips, because they're so cryptic. They're going to be hidden in the closed petals, the bracts, all that stuff, the axils of the leaves. So it'll be hard to get complete control. But typically, the chili thrips are going to be the most important one. The flower thrips can be common, but oftentimes the people's roses develop pretty well without, without management.
Matt, one question has come in, which is, other than Japanese beetles, what would you say the #1 insect pest that comes into the lab for roses is?
I don't know offhand. We don't get a lot of insects on roses, people asking about them. I would say that the most confused and probably the most serious will be chili thrips, because they do cause those distorted leaves, and it's a fairly distinct damage. People notice it pretty quickly.
Yes, thank you.
Hey, Mike, how you doing?
Good. I was going to, oops, I can't spell. Yeah, the question there set my mind on another train there about what we see more of. If that question are asked of me, I'll have to kind of hem and haw. But and one problem is that what we see in the clinic isn't necessarily the same as what's seen in the landscape, because if someone recognizes it, or if the master gardener, the extension agent recognizes it, then it never reaches us. I will say though that the one we see the most often on rose as far as diseases is the first one I'll talk about, which is the last one that Matt talked about, which is rose rosette. So let me go ahead and share. Let's see. Screen sharing failed to start. There we go. So can everyone see a single slide there of?
Yes, looks great.
An old classic image of a rose garden. I've broken this part down into 4 sections, starting out with rose rosette disease, and then talking about 2 root diseases, one of which is much more common than the other, a couple of cane diseases, and then 3 foliar diseases. So try and give a little structure to this. I will say that I did include some information on management this time, maybe more than usual, but hopefully that is of help. Going right ahead then, starting as Matt did with a quiz. Which of these photos is of rose rosette disease? And let me go to launch a poll. Okay. Oops, that's not right. I'm sorry, folks. I hit edit instead of end. I don't know why. There we go, relaunching. All right, which of these 4 photos, A, B, C, D, would you say represents rose rosette disease? So you had a little head start there to think about it before I was able to get the poll up and running. I'll let it run for another 10 or 15 seconds here. People are answering at record speed here. I've never seen so many responses come in such a short period of time, so that's good. And it's looking good too, that people really know what they are seeing when it comes to this. I will end it there and share it. And yes, the 76% who said D are in fact correct. But what are the others? Well, the first slide there was of what we call rose mosaic. And this is also a viral disease. Think about the happy days gone by when the only real virus problem we saw in roses was this. It's actually a virus complex, so there's more than one involved. There's prunus necrotic ring spot and apple mosaic, and maybe a little of Arabis mosaic as well that can be alone or in combination. And it was basically something that was transmitted by grafting. In fact, there's an idea that they may have gotten into rose stalks when apple was being used to try and use those as rootstocks. In any case, it's a cosmetic, basically a cosmetic problem, widespread. You'll see it now and then with either a bright yellow chlorosis, blotchiness, or even these nice oak leaf patterns. But you notice that there's not really any deformation of the leaf itself. It's a color change. The second photo was of herbicide injury, which can mimic rosette. I mean, mimic not in the sense of intentionally, but it can look like the leaf strapping caused by rosette. But one difference is that, first of all, well, Matt found no mites on it, and so that's one clue that we had. But also the witch's broom, it doesn't retain the red color. A retention of a juvenile red color is a important symptom of rosette, and here we see it's quite green. So that would, at the beginning, make you suspect that this might be something else. And in fact, Joe Neal, we showed it to him, and he thought it might be a light dose of an ALS inhibitor type herbicide. The third picture was chili thrips, which you may have recognized from Matt's presentation, although this particular photograph is from Steve Frank, also in our department here, from November, no, excuse me, this is not the original finding back in November of 2011. This is, again, chili thrips. So definitely be looking for that as well. And then, of course, rosette, which most folks got. You see a lot of symptoms here: the retention of the juvenile color, the elongation, the witch's broom, the deformation of the flowers, and so forth. And just to list those out, I should mention too that the death of the plant they typically say 3 to 5 years after being infected, but I think I've seen some that have hung on even longer than that. Not that you want to keep them on. And so if it hasn't outright died, it's probably going to be removed by whoever's in charge of the landscape, unless it's a neglected site, in which case you have another problem, and I'll mention that in a minute. The other thing to keep in mind here is that the symptoms are going to be variable with the cultivar, with the season, and how long the plant has been affected. So you want to be watching for these symptoms, but realizing that you may get a different set of them, a different suite of them, depending on those factors. So for example, one of the early symptoms, an early warning sign, this is from last spring out at Fred Fletcher Park, the elongation of those shoots, and notice how that juvenile red coloration has not disappeared like it should. So that is a good early sign of rosette, although it's not 100% an indicator. There are two symptoms that are unmistakably rosette symptoms that you would not confuse, but they're not always present. One of them is the classic hyperthorniness, so a density of thorns that is multiples of what it should be. And the other is the extra thickness of the daughter branches coming off of the cane. So you'll notice here that, go to the annotation. You'll notice here that that branch coming off of this cane is actually thicker than the parent. So that is another classic rosette symptom. If you do see it, then that's what you've got. A quick snapshot of some facts about this disease. It is caused by a virus that's been named rosette virus. That was actually only discovered, let me see, when was it? 19 even, was around 2011, I think, that it was actually discovered as a virus, and then it wasn't even proven till several years later. It is systemic, so it gets throughout the plant, even down to the roots, and it is incurable. So once a plant has this, it's not going to recover. Fortunately, it affects only roses, so we don't have to worry about it being a problem for other plants in the landscape. It's transmissible by grafting, but not by pruning shears. So that's one other sort of silver lining there, is that it's not, unlike some of the other diseases we'll talk about, for example, the common canker, that's not something you're going to spread by your pruning shears. It's also not persistent in the soil, so you don't have to wait very long after you remove the plant to be able to come in with another rose if that's what you wanted to do. And as Matt mentioned, it is transmitted by an areophyte mite, Phyllocoptes fructiferus, and there is evidence they found it in another species of mite, but it's not actually proven to be a vector or to be able to transmit it. So for right now, that's the only proven vector, is this particular microscopic mite. One scary thing about this disease is that it has a very long incubation period. So you can go anywhere from 30 days to almost 5 months between when the mites transferred the virus to the plant and when you start seeing symptoms, meaning that you may have purchased or sold, if you're a nursery owner, a plant that's infected without realizing it. How do we prevent this then? I want to talk a little bit about prevention and then a little bit about what do you do if you've got it. During your planning and planting phase, make sure you space these roses out so that you don't have a bridge, the foliage of one touching another, for those mites to be able to walk across. And also there is, the way I read it was anecdotal evidence that it may transfer from one plant to another through root grafts. That does happen for a couple of those viruses that are involved in rose mosaic. So it's understandable that it would do the same with rose rosette. So keep those rose plants spaced apart and use a diversity of plants, as we often talk about here on PPP, in your landscape. Green barriers may help around the rose planting so that when the winds do bring those mites, they don't have wings, they don't fly, but they can blow around on the breeze, and it helps to reduce those that are actually going to reach the rose planting. Start with clean stock, and there are new testing protocols that are in development. They're very good sensitive tests, but they require specialized equipment. So hopefully they'll be getting out to the nurseries ways that they can test their stock easier and make sure that they don't have asymptomatic but infected roses. And genetic resistance, there's work ongoing on that, so stay tuned on that front. Also, as far as prevention, during the winter, there are two things that you can do. One is to prune those roses to remove the mite refuges. So they like to hang out in the dead flowers and of course in the leaf axils, as Matt talked about. And also you can use dormant oils during the winter to try and reduce those mite populations. Any time of the year, as far as prevention, you want to make sure you remove diseased roses on neglected sites and any kind of multiflora roses within 100 yards. This photograph is one that my son took 2 years ago now, and it is an untended, sort of a neglected strip of land between two very popular fast food restaurants in Raleigh. So if that's one of the challenges, is if you've got these infected roses on neglected areas, then you may have reservoirs of it. And I'll mention something that's happening in Wilson County that may help with that sort of thing. And then in your own planting, be vigilant. So if you're out there checking every week, that's good. Every day, that's something they did. Mark Wyndham, who's one of the people who's been working on this disease, was also in charge of disease management on an endowed rose garden there at the University of Tennessee. And he had his students under the threat of being fired if he saw a symptomatic rose bush before they did. So they immediately would identify something and remove it. And they were able to keep ahead of it so that the public wasn't even aware that there was any kind of more than just normal turnover in the planting. During the growing season, this gets a little bit beyond what we normally do in PPP, but there are miticides that have been found to be effective. Not all miticides will work against areophytes. The problem here, though, is that when these tests were done, they were at weekly spray intervals. So that was a really heavy schedule that no one would really follow. And because of funding issues, the follow-up work hasn't been done yet to find out if these would work at a reduced spray schedule, a more reasonable one. So what do you do if you have a rose rosette infected plant in your flower bed? You want to always get the shovel, because that is not going to be a plant that you can try and save. Remove it after you bag it and cut it at ground level. The reason for the bagging, of course, is so that you don't get the mites moving and spreading it beyond that infected plant. You want to get the root system out so that it does not resprout, because any resprouts would also have the high potential of being infected. Another thing to say is that if you try and just prune it, the studies show that if you catch it early, 68% of symptomatic roses can be rescued if pruned at the first symptom. And that means taking it all the way down to the crown. But then if you go 4 to 6 weeks later, then it's only going to be 30% effective. So we are not recommending pruning as a strategy. It's removal. Another thing that's to be avoided is the use of leaf blowers when cleaning up fallen leaves in rose beds, because of the possibility of giving the mites a ride, a little boost there. I mentioned the Wilson County situation, and there's a program there called Keep Wilson Rosy. Are there, how many Wilson folks are on here? Let me look over at the, I guess I can't see immediately how many they would be. Go ahead.
Yeah, Mike, we can't really tell easily, but if folks are listening and you're from Wilson County, by all means, put it in the chat.
Yeah, so we know, and if you have, especially if you've gotten involved with this particular program, which is basically to educate the public and identify infected roses in the community and get those removed. And their Facebook page is called the Wilson Rose Busters. Another good source online is roserosette.org, where you can see photographs and watch a fairly long video about rose rosette. So make some popcorn for it if you do decide to do that. And it is the page where you can see the multiple institutions there that were involved in the rose rosette project. And a good 2-page guide to this. And let me see, I'll try and, unfortunately I can't drop that in the chat, but the University of Tennessee having a good 2-page guide on early detection of rose rosette. Moving then along to our root diseases. Here is a graphic that I made of all the different hosts on which we've diagnosed armillaria root rot for the period from 2008 to 2021, almost to the end of last year. And the quiz question here is, in which place on this graphic is the is rose as a host? So I'll go ahead and relaunch the poll. And do you think it's in pie slice A, B, C, or D? The other smaller ones are indicated there of Azaleas prunus and Leyland cypress. I'll let that go for just a couple of seconds. 10, 9, 8. See, people were a little bit more reluctant here on this one. We were still a really good response, 95 so far. One more, let's get 100. There we go. So I can't argue with that. In fact, A and B are so close to one another. So really, if you answered A or B, you would be correct. And here are the names to go with those pie slices. So rose was at the very top, arborvitae was next place, but guess what? Arborvitae, there was another one since that came in since I had made the graphic. So it was really A and B were tied. And I had to even go back and see how I defined arborvitae, but really neck and neck there. Hollies and junipers taking up 3rd and 4th place respectively. These are the ones where we see armillaria, and we've talked about this disease quite a bit on PPP, but just to go over it quickly, armillaria root rot, also called mushroom root rot or shoestring root rot, is caused by several species within the genus Armillaria. Here is a rose that was submitted by one of our athletic department landscapes on campus here, and you see that it had completely collapsed, dried out, and looking under the bark there of a large root, there's the white mycelium typical of this particular fungus. You want to always look under the bark at the base of the main stem or in the larger roots like this. Here is another sample that came in, which was interesting in that you had not only the fungus visible here on the bark, the inside of the bark there from the base, but here, these darker structures are the remains of the cluster of mushrooms where it had produced, the fungus had produced its spores earlier and then dried out. So this is one of those unusual cases where we could actually tell you that this species, in fact, was now called Des Armillaria tubescens. Then it was Armillaria tubescens. What should you do in this case? You remove the plant and don't replace that, or don't put any woody plants in that spot for, I would say, at least 2 years. The danger of it spreading, there is some danger that it could spread. I know that our niece had this problem in a very crowded landscape bed, and the other plants around seem to be doing, at least they haven't died, and she removed the rose that was infected with Armillaria. Matt, what happened in your landscape there? Because you had this problem on a rose. Putting you on the spot here.
This may have been, there was, we had a dead prunus that died that had Armillaria that was only about 10 feet, 15 feet away from the rose that had Armillaria. So I suspect they were related. I don't know which came first though.
Right. That is of course a problem, because these things can drag on. With Armillaria, it may be a chronic situation, or you may see sudden collapse. Oops. Another much less frequent root problem on roses is crown gall caused by the bacterium Agrobacterium tumefaciens, and it can affect different areas. So you'll see on the slide or the photo on the left, that was a very smooth gall on a stem there. And this is in a production setting. Atypical, because they're usually not that smooth, but that was actually confirmed by PCR as being crown gall. The others were not confirmed, but in the middle there was certainly suspected. So you see the galling on the roots, either both large and smaller roots, and then a classic photograph from the department slide collection there of a gall at the actual crown level. This bacterium needs wounds to infect, so you want to make sure you avoid unnecessary wounding of the plant. We don't actually, again, see that often on rose, but if you know you have that in your soil, rose is probably something you would want to think twice about putting in. And of course, if you've got bare root plants, inspect those to make sure that you're not bringing it into your landscape. Moving on to now the cane diseases, from the roots up now to the canes. Which picture here represents botrytis canker? So let me relaunch this poll. And of course, if anybody puts C or D, then I know that I've done something terribly wrong here. There are actually 2 clues in this photograph as to which one it is. Wow, doesn't get any more even than this. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Let's go ahead and stop it there. And by a hair, B has 1 with 51%. And let's see which one it was. Yes, in fact, it was B. And the 2 clues there, one is the light tan color to the canker. And also, and this was probably, likely it was after incubation here in the lab in a human chamber, but there's also the sporulation of the fungus visible on the surface of that stem. So there's 2 clues that you had botrytis canker. You're not always going to see, probably won't see that fungal sporulation though, unless you've incubated it first. Be aware too that the same fungus can cause spotting on the rose blossoms, on the petals. Here's another couple of images of botrytis canker. The fungus is Botrytis cinerea. There may be other species involved as well. It turns out that not everything that was called Botrytis cinerea is in fact a single species. Again, notice how the canker has a very light color, and on the left it's lower down on the cane, and the right it's farther up. And had you had this been something else like well, let me just show you what happens if you incubate something like this. You can even get a whole mass of the sporulation. So that's why it's called gray mold. So botrytis and gray mold are fairly synonyms. Now let's compare this to common canker of rose, which we actually see more of this probably in the landscapes than we do botrytis. And even after incubation, you've only got just a little bit of fuzziness there. So kind of ignore that because you're not going to see it in the field. But notice how the darker color, except in the center of the lesion. And you're also seeing these small black flecks are the fruiting bodies where the spores are produced. So very different from what you would see on botrytis. The same fungus on blackberry causes what's called cane blight. And you have to have some kind of wound for this to infect. So oftentimes it's a pruning wound, but it doesn't have to be something that dramatic. Even minor wounds can become infected. For management of canker diseases, you certainly want to prune out the cankers, going several inches into clean wood. Choose a dry day to do this so you're not spreading spores, and also sanitize your tools frequently. Of course, botrytis is going to be airborne, so that's just generally out and about in the air, but a dry day is going to help you then for, as it won't be the conditions won't be conducive for infection. Avoiding stress and injury is always recommended for keeping our woody plants more resistant to canker diseases. So as we always talk about, match your plants and your sites, use the proper planting techniques, optimize your water and your fertilization. And one of the important ways to do that is, of course, with proper mulching. Avoid unnecessary wounds and reduce the amount of freeze injury that occurs by making sure that you don't encourage a lot of fresh growth late in the growing season by either pruning heavily or by fertilizing. And finally, avoid your overhead irrigation, which keeps the leaves and stems wet and encourages the growth and the infection by these fungi. Moving up further on the plant, let's talk a little bit about foliar diseases. And this one you won't be able to do a poll on, so just kind of jot down there on a piece of paper that you've got, or on the back of your hand, or just think in your mind what might be the letter corresponding to each of these three foliar rose diseases: black spot, cercospora leaf spot, and downy mildew. So give everybody just a moment to do that. All right. And hopefully you came out with this: black spot B, cercospora leaf spot C, and downy mildew A. And you'll notice that I'm not going to talk about downy mildew. And the reason is not that it's not an important disease, it's extremely important, but in production. We've only had, in this current database, we've only had a confirmed or suspected case of downy mildew in a landscape rose twice. And one of those, it was one that had just been bought 2 weeks earlier and put into the landscape. So this is a real headache if you are a rose producer, but it's not something that we're going to really see in the landscapes. On the other hand, black spot and cercospora leaf spot, we do. And so let's talk a little bit about those two. Both are fungal diseases. Black spot is caused by a fungus called Diplocarpon rosae, also called Marsanina rosae. And the symptoms there are going to be similar on the two. With the dark spots, there may be some chlorosis, some yellowing associated with it, and also leaf drop. So at a first pass, it may be hard to distinguish them, but we're going to look more closely. Now, the name cercospora leaf spot, you'll notice that maybe you noticed when I first mentioned it in the list that we had at the top of the segment, I put it in quotes because it was originally called cercospora leaf spot, but then it was renamed as, well, the fungus was classified as a cercospora, then it was renamed as a passiflora, and now it's called something else. It's Rosespharella rosicola. So hard to keep track of these scientific names, and a lot of people are just going to know it as cercospora leaf spot, and I've chosen to do that here as well. So how are you going to tell them apart? If you look closely at a black spot lesion, you'll notice that it has a rather feathery margin. It's not a distinct line, and it's also a very dark color. If you look at a cercospora leaf spot lesion, you'll notice that the margin is more even and is a lighter color. So those two things are your clue. They will both have somewhat dark, small fruiting bodies visible there in them, producing spores in a very different way, but the main thing you want to look for is the color and the margins of that spot to tell the difference. And keep in mind that black spot is not just on the leaves. So here are some pictures of lesions on a rose cane caused by black spot, which is going to be the lead into why we're using one of the techniques that we're using for controlling it. So IPM of rose leaf spot diseases is going to involve pruning out infected canes in the winter and also cleaning out the fallen leaves or adding that new layer of mulch in the wintertime. And this is because the fungus, at least with the black spot, can overwinter on the canes as well as on the leaves, so those fallen leaves. Choose resistant cultivars if you're looking for a new rose to put in, and if you've already got roses that are susceptible to black spot or cercospora leaf spot, then you're going to need you're either going to need to spray or you're going to need to have a pretty high tolerance for the spots and the leaf drop. And moisture management is going to be important for these too. The pruning to make sure you've got good air movement, watering to avoid wetting the leaves, and not extending that overnight leaf wetness period. So if we think about the hours of dew that we have in most summer mornings around here, we don't want to increase that from, let's say, a 4 or 5 hour period to a 6 or 7 hour period by watering at the end or at the beginning of that time. So watering while they're, if you have to water the leaves, watering them where they're wet from dew is probably less of a problem than doing it just at the time when that dew is getting ready to disappear. As far as pruning, the recommendation, of course, is that we should be pruning things in the spring just as the buds break dormancy, so awfully soon now for most of us. If you take a look at the IPM for shrubs in Southeast US nursery production, then even though the focus is on nurseries, there are some nice tables of resistances in the rose chapter. So if you look, for example, here we've got several cultivars listed. This is a small piece of that table with the disease ratings for the 3: black spot, cercospora leaf spot, and powdery mildew, which I haven't mentioned yet. We don't see so much of that, and it is, of course, easier to recognize with the typical powdery mildew look, the signs of the fungus there on the leaves. The fungus is called Potosphaera pinosa, and unfortunately, this one, the moisture conditions don't have to be as high as the typical fungal leaf spot for this to take off, but for some reason we just don't see that much of it on our rose. It may be that there's a lot of resistance out there, I'm not sure. With that, I will attempt to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mike. One question came in, I think it's referring back to the botrytis canker, is could you also get that same canker on a tomato stem? Are we seeing that on tomato as well?
Yes, botrytis does cause a canker on tomatoes. Let me see here. It's usually, and I'll mention this in the bolos too, for the pansies, late winter, early spring, we'll get a lot of botrytis blight on it. It seems to me though, when we see it on tomato, what time of year and in what setting was the question? Because I would think of that as more of a wintertime greenhouse tomato problem rather than a summertime out in the vegetable garden problem.
I don't have a specific on that just yet. Maybe Laura will put that in the chat, but just in terms of recognizing that same type of canker that we discussed on tomato, she's right in recognizing that.
Although you want to be careful because you could also have an early blight lesion that you might mistake for that.
Okay, good point.
Yeah.
I'm
looking at our data here, and it's botrytis on tomato is almost exclusively a greenhouse situation.
Okay. Someone was looking for clarification of just the terminology you used, green barriers. I think you were just referring to planting other plants around your roses, between your roses, as a physical barrier in a way for those thrips. Is that what you were thinking of?
Right. The study specifically were using things like miscanthus grass around the, or at least on one side of the planting to try and intercept those prevailing winds, and the mites drop off there, and they'll they will not be able to do anything if they're on a non-host.
Excellent.
And they don't survive very long off their host either. The thought is around 8 hours. So
Oh, wow. That's good to know.
yeah, because one thing, potentially a way of moving them would even be on your clothing, but it wouldn't be a problem from one day to the next. It would just be if you were in an infested area and went to another one in the same day.
Okay. Someone was inquiring if we do see the same issues on native roses as we are on our cultivated roses. What's your experience with those?
I really don't have experience with the native roses.
Okay.
So I cannot answer that. I would expect, though, I know the rose rosette in particular, that's been looked at well, and there are a lot of different species of roses that are susceptible. And I don't know where it stands as far as whether some of the other native species would have resistance to that. Again, about the resistance issue, kind of stay tuned on that. But yeah, I can't really speak to that because I don't have the experience with the natives.
Okay, no worries. We are pretty much caught up there. Deborah is making an observation that she's learned about regarding vineyards and the use of roses in vineyards to determine if black rot is present. I don't know if you've read anything about that, Mike. Before they get the roses, the black rot would get the roses before it gets the grapevines.
That would be, let's see, I would have to look into that because I had not heard of that. It's a little bit strange because that's not a disease. If I'm thinking, yeah, that I would need to know more about that to really comment. So if they have a specific reference, then they can send it, and then maybe we'll talk about it next program.
Great. All right, thank you so much. Well done. And
You're welcome.
the good thing is we have the recording, so we can always be going back to the slides that you've provided for us and getting that detail, and certainly get all the links that you shared of those good resources.
And yeah, thank you I know that you guys are great about providing those after the program in an email. So thank you for covering for my neglect and not having those links ready to paste into the chat.
Not of it. That's why we're here. And we all need to look back, and it's great that we have those recordings and we have the index. And now we'll look towards turning it over to Charlotte. I think we're going to do plant these instead. So Mike, I think you have stopped your share, or would you please? And then Charlotte will share. All right, we're having a little technical difficulty. It might be that Charlotte's sound has dropped. Sometimes that happens. And if we don't get her back, Matt, would you be willing to jump on to our bolos and we'll just switch the order of things?
Yeah, sure thing. I can.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and do that, and I'll let her communicate with me in the chat when she can.
Okay.
But if you'd share your bolos, that would keep us rolling.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Where am I going? Okay, I gotta go. Let's see. Okay. Sorry about this. Okay.
Not a bit. Thank you.
Hopefully can you all see that? Carolyn, can you
Yes,
see that?
we are in the right
great.
spot. Insect bolos.
Good. Great. So insect bolos from February to March. So because it's warming up, insects are waking up. And so in March, we often start to see solitary bees, especially ground nesting bees, coming out. These are native pollinators. They are not aggressive. They don't sting. You'd have to actually do a lot to get them to sting. I even laid in this colony of them to take these photos. So be aware of them, but know that they are only around for a few weeks or so before they go back into kind of mode as a larva when their larvae survive. Ants will be out and about too. Also things that are hibernating over the winter, things like stink bugs, paper wasps, hornets, ladybugs will start to wake up from their slumber and begin to become active again. We may also be seeing inchworms like fall cankerworm is dropping down from trees and defoliating some trees once the trees actually leaf out. Boxwood leaf miners, it probably would come in the later end of March, early April, that we're going to see them, but be on the lookout for boxwoods with little orange flies swarming around them. Those are the adults that are going to lay eggs in the new foliage. And scale insects are starting to get active. They're going to become, start developing more. They're going to mate soon and start producing crawlers, especially some species. So these are going to be the major insects and arthropods to look out for. Again, everything's just starting to wake up. Once the plants leaf out and have flowers and things like that, and it starts to warm regularly, then we're going to see a lot more activity as well. Okay, and Mike.
Thanks, Matt. We will turn it over to Mike when you get a chance. And I can see, I think Charlotte's having some phone trouble trying to call back in. So we'll just have patience and it will be fine.
Mike, you there? You want to do the bolos?
I am here. Sorry, I had my microphone off. Let me go ahead and pull up the bolos for our diseases here. And, you know, we do look at, I know that those of you who have participated in the past, you're always offered that opportunity to give an evaluation of PPP at the end of the year. And we do look at those and consider those comments. And one of the ones that I got was that that maybe do fewer bolos and in more detail, or just not doing quite so many, because we do have them on the website, so you can always go and look up the long list of what to expect for each month of the year on our website. The bolo link is on the left hand side on our main page. So let me go ahead and just do a more brief bolo presentation this time than what I may have done in the past. Showing the slides and sharing. So our first on the list here is Entomosporium leaf spot on both Indian hawthorn and red tip photinia. We've talked about this before. Because it overwinters on the leaves on the plant, instead of worrying so much now about the fallen leaves, it's the existing leaves. This is something that you've probably seen throughout the winter and maybe seeing again more now as people get out and about. Another is Sclerotinia stem rot, which occasionally pops up on our crucifer crops in the cooler months. And it is characterized by a rot in the stem, and you may get that white mass there. So this is also sometimes called white mold, because there's the sign of the fungus there. I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about botrytis blight or botrytis canker on rose, but we do see the same fungus. It's very, I won't call it an omnivore, but it's plurivorous, they call it. So it has many things that it likes to eat, and including our pansies and violas. So the winter, as it starts to wane, we get a little bit warmer temperatures, some more moisture in the air, and we start to see this occurring. It likes to get started on senescent or dying tissue, so let's say blossoms especially, and then can move into the leaves. Camellia petal blight, another one that's been a frequent feature on Plants, Pests and Pathogens. So if you want to see, I think I talked last year in February how you would identify this and distinguish between Camellia petal blight and frost injury to the blossoms. And of course, make sure that you have those picked up. And if you do have Camellia japonicas, by now have that extra inch or two of mulch laid down, so that any sclerotia that were over summering and then overwintering aren't able to have their spores get up to the new blossoms. Boxwood blight is a continual threat, and keep on the lookout for that with the three symptoms we've talked about so often: the dark leaf spots, the dark streaking on the green twigs, and the defoliation. And then finally, one that we you could see it any time of year really, but it tends to be noticed more in the winter when the leaves are bare, is Septibasidium. So we've already had a couple of samples of this, image samples of this being sent in. This one's from Mart Bumgardner, and it is maybe a light tan color like this, or it may be a very dark color, but a felty mat of fungal growth on a twig, often encircling the twig, fairly thick, and common on oaks, on hollies, on nyssa, black gum, and on apple, as you see here. Those are some of the ones that we see it on multiple times, although it can really be on just about any woody host that has scale insects. And the reason for that is, I'll let Matt chime in.
Yeah, so this fungus is only associated with armored scales, and it apparently, there's some debate on whether it's a mutualism, where the fungus gets food from some of the scales and some of the scales get protection, but the scales are definitely eaten by the fungus. And so when you see these mats of fungi, you can kind of scrape the bark underneath to see that it's green, it's not a plant pathogen, but once you see it fairly often, you'll get to recognize it. And most often on smooth bark twigs, but basically you have a scale issue, and that treating this for the scales will help manage the fungus issue. But if it's something that you don't mind, it's just little patches, it's not actually going to harm the tree.
And that's a good point, that if this were, let's say, the sporulation, the fruiting body of a wood decay fungus, a slash rotter, then you would find that twig under there was actually completely dead. But if you scrape that off, go under the bark, and you see nice green cambium, then it was likely this. All right.
Thank you, Mike. I think we
Okay.
may have Charlotte back. Let me just give her a second and see if she's there. She's called in from a different phone, and she's got her slides coming
you
up.
hear
So it's
me?
looking good. Now we hear you.
Yes, we
There
can
she
hear you.
is. Great.
Great. It was actually my headset. The problem was never my
Oh.
phone. So,
Oh.
but I've seemed to have got it working again. All right. So I'm really excited to be here and share Plant These Instead. So if you're new to Plant These Instead, new to Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, this is a regular feature we held every one of our Plants, Pests, and Pathogens, where we focus on alternatives to pest-prone or invasive species that are commonly planted in in-sea landscapes. So these are things you can plant instead. We want to just remind everybody, diversity is the key to a healthy, resilient landscape. There's not a one plant fits all situation. You always have to select the right plant for your site conditions, and that includes being aware of disease issues you've had and that could affect the things you're planting after. So always do that research to find the plants that suit your site and will perform the function you need in your landscape. And that's exactly what the Extension Gardener Plant Toolbox is for. It will allow you to explore over 4,500 plants for southeastern landscapes and find the right one for your conditions. We do have the Plant These Instead archive, so all of the slides from last year's Plant These Instead features and this year will be available here. When you open it, when you go to this link, it'll be full screen, so you can either use your arrow buttons or your mouse to just scroll through the slides. There are links, all of the links are live, so when you click on any of the plant names especially, that will open the Plant Toolbox profile for that plant, and that's where you can find out all the details about where it grows, what conditions it needs, where it's hardy. So the links are already built in for you to find more. And the recordings are also posted, so you can go and find the recording from a specific Plant These Instead feature there. All right, so we are talking about Plant These Instead for roses today. There are just hundreds of rose varieties and many, many species. As we've heard, they're prone to many plant disease and pest issues, and they range from just being annoying to potentially fatal. And some of them, particularly some of those diseases like armillaria, they persist in the soil, so you wouldn't want to replant a rose there where that had grown. So we're going to look at some alternatives. And so thinking about alternatives to roses, we're really thinking, well, why do we plant roses? And for many people, it is about the fragrance and the romance of a rose. You know, a lot of the fragrant varieties have these very intricate flowers, larger flowers, and are fairly high care plants. Then we also have this other group of roses, the landscape roses, such as the knockouts, which are grown for color. They typically don't have a lot of fragrance, although there's a few varieties out there that may. But we're going to focus on that fragrant feature today. So what are some other things you can plant for fragrance if you struggle with roses or don't want to have to put in the management that's required for some of the pest and disease issues on roses? But you want fragrance. So we're just highlighting a few options. Of course, you can explore many more in the plant toolbox, and a couple of spring blooming fragrant shrubs. Something that's probably blooming right now, the paper bush, Edgeworthia chrysantha. This is a really large leaf shrub. These are both deciduous. And this paper bush actually likes to grow in some light shade and moist and well-drained soil, but these very, very fragrant flowers open up at this time of the year, just before and just as the leaves are coming out. And it's quite an architectural and striking plant. So if you're not familiar with it, I encourage you to go and learn more about it. Then there are viburnums. So we actually have a lot of native viburnums, but our native viburnums typically smell terrible. I would not smell most native viburnums. It is the Asian viburnums that have very sweet fragrances. So this, the Judd viburnum is a hybrid. It's Viburnum juddii, but it's a hybrid between Viburnum carlesii and Viburnum betuense. Carlesii is the one that's is very, very fragrant, and there are several hybrids and cultivars of it, and it tends to pass those fragrant genes on to its offspring. So for our spring blooming viburnums, for just very sweet drifting fragrance, this is a good landscape performer for the Southeast. Into the summertime, there are, of course, quite a few things. Gardenias may come to mind, but I just wanted to mention the butterfly bush, which of course is very familiar to most people, been around for a while, very popular, a lot of cultivars. It does need well-drained soil and prefers to be out in the sun. It reminds me of roses, some that, you have to prune it and cut it back every year, but it is more carefree once it starts growing, typically through the season, as long as you get that well-drained soil. It's very important. Otherwise, you can have some root rot issues. But I did want to point out, when you're selecting butterfly bush, to look for some of the newer cultivars that have been developed to be sterile or have low fertility. So one of those is the Lo and Behold series, which is actually bred by NC State. And this one in the picture is called Lo and Behold Purple Haze. And it has these longer florets. A lot of the Lo and Behold just have kind of a little bit of a short flower. But this one's much longer. It's kind of that purpley blue that you see and carries that typical buddleia fragrance. Another buddleia, and this one is a hybrid that tends to be sterile, is Buddleia crosswireriana. There's a couple of named cultivars, Sun Gold and Honeycomb, pretty easy to find. It's a little bit taller. It's definitely going to be taller than the Lo and Behold, but it has these, very cute and a little bit different yellow flowers that are in little rounded balls of flowers on a longer scape. So just a little bit of a different look for a butterfly bush. So a little something different if you're out there looking for butterfly bush, for the fragrance especially, and of course, pollinators love it. And if you're specifically seeking a native plant for fragrance, a couple of options would be the Carolina allspice or Sweet Betsy, which is native throughout most of the state, not so much in the eastern coastal area, but it does grow well there. And it's an old-fashioned plant that I know both my grandmothers grew, the Calycanthus floridus. It is a woodland shrub, so it does like the part shade, and it blooms in the spring, and it has these very unusual looking flowers. The species itself has this kind of burgundy maroon color flower, and the fragrance tends to be stronger when the flowers have warmed up or had some sunlight shining on them, so a little bit later in the day rather than first thing in the morning. And then there is this selected variety named Athens, which has a lime green flower, and it is supposed to be quite reliable for fragrance, whereas just seedlings might be a little variable in their fragrance. There are other named varieties of the maroon flowered form, but Athens is supposed to have some of the most reliable and strongest fragrance. And then there are hybrids out there as well, where our native calycanthus has been crossed with some of the Asian species, and they make quite large shrubs with larger flowers. So for spring, look at calycanthus if you want a native plant for fragrance. For the summer, sweet pepperbush or Clethra alnifolia occurs in the eastern and central part of the state. It will grow in the west and is typically white flowered, but there are a few pink or kind of light pink flowered varieties available. A lot of the newer selections have been chosen to be more compact, but they're all extremely fragrant and a very drifting fragrance. So just a wonderful shrub. Another one that will grow in part shade or mostly sunny conditions. And typically in the wild, you find it all along the edge of the woods. So absolutely the fragrance of summer for me, because I grew up in the eastern part of the state, and you knew it was summer when the Clethra started blooming. So there are many more options out there that you can explore on the plant toolbox. Some of the ones we looked at, I went through and was able to select with the Find a Plant feature. But if you go to the archive, this slide is on the archive, and you click View These Results, you'll see all 100 plants that result from selecting these options under the Find a Plant feature. And you can certainly narrow it down a lot more by selecting some of the other attributes that are listed there. So you can get right to the plants that fit your landscape and fit what you're looking for. Every plant on the plant toolbox has a QR code on its profile. You have to scroll down. So scroll down, it's lower down on the page, but you can simply click on that and copy and paste. And you can use that QR code on plant labels in your demonstration garden, on flyers, on plant sale information. So make use of those QR codes as a way to get people to more to the detailed information about specific plants. Here's an example of one in a demonstration garden that just has the QR code that you could then scan with your phone. It would take you right to that page for that specific plant. We had bolos, so thank you much to Matt and Mike, and we will finish out, I know just a few minutes over time, with a few announcements. And first, a big hearty thank you for everything that all of our Master Gardener volunteers do, and our extension agents, and everybody who helps support the program. We did just release the annual report yesterday. I hope you've had the opportunity to see it. It's posted on the EMG intranet. We'll send the link as the follow-up email. But, you know, we have over 3,800 volunteers in North Carolina, and last year they volunteered for 158 hours of volunteer service. So that is just so impressive, and the work that's being done and the people that are being reached really does make a difference in helping people garden more sustainably. So thank you all. You've probably seen announcements about the second edition of the Extension Gardener Handbook being now available from UNC Press. There's not a major change in the content, but there are small kind of changes and corrections throughout, some new images and things like that. So you could purchase a copy online directly from UNC Press. And if you are an agent or Master Gardener volunteer, there is a 30% discount, and the information of that discount code is on the EMG intranet. There are some plant ID classes coming up. These are held in partnership between NC State and Longwood Gardens. There are a whole variety starting in March. The one on flowers, the one on houseplants, the one on edible plants. All have sessions starting March 21st, so you can go online and sign up for those. Again, there is a discount for Master Gardener volunteers and for extension professionals. If you don't have the discount codes for those, you can email the EG-online-classes to get that discount code, or ask your agent. So I encourage you to check out those online classes. There are also some online courses in therapeutic horticulture. The introduction course is starting in, is that next week? Very soon, March 7th. The more advanced class is already going on, the therapeutic horticulture program development, but it will be offered again. So if you want to learn more about those, you can go online and find out about when they'll be offered and what they cover. And the J.C. Ralston Arboretum continues to offer many, many opportunities, including tomorrow, their Gardening 101, which is online. We'll talk about outstanding conifers for Southeast Gardens, and that will be by Doug Rurin, who's the gardens manager. So conifers can be a hit and miss group of plants for especially the more coastal and eastern parts of the state. So you may learn about some species to give a chance in your garden if you are interested in adding more conifers. And we will wrap up there and just wish everybody happy gardening till we meet again. That will be March 22nd, where we'll have Dr. Bill Fontenot with us to talk about growing great garden soil. So much appreciation to everyone for joining us today, and wish you all the best. See you next month.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.